Okay, hi everybody. Today we want to talk about uh, more about information that guides assessment, whether you're working with children or adults across the lifespan, information that guides assessment. We have discussed models of speech and language, which reveal variables or components of speech and language that can be evaluated, that we look for, that we plan for when we evaluate a speech or language problem. Now we're going to look at behavioral systems outside of speech and language that contribute to speech and language performance. We refer to those as maintaining factors. And there are three behavioral systems that we particularly focus on to identify, evaluate whether they are influencing the behavior that we're observing. Those three behavioral systems are cognition, sensory motor behavior, and the psychosocial / cultural system that the client brings with them, him or her, to the task of speech and language, quite frankly, and also to our clinic. So we're going to quickly review these behavioral systems since I know you have background on this. These systems from language acquisition in children, language disorders in children, possibly language learning disabilities, aphasia, or adult language disorders, whatever background courses you're bringing to this particular class. And again, what we're trying to do in this course is help, my job really is to help you construct, put together a mental model of speech and language that you are going to apply to the assessment process, and of course a model of the process itself, a problem solving, creative problem solving process. Okay, we're going to continue on here. The first of the maintaining factors that I want to remind you of, since I know you've had this material in language acquisition, language disorders, and likely elsewhere. These are factors, again, that are interacting with language and that could be contributing both to a language disorder or a language or communication problem, speech problem, that would need to be addressed, first evaluated, and then addressed in assessment. And they also may need to be addressed in intervention planning. And remember that one of the primary reasons for doing an assessment is to lay the groundwork for intervention planning, that is goal and procedure planning. Let's reflect again upon cognition first, and there are two perspectives that are typical in the area of cognition, and that is the Piagetian perspective and the information processing perspective. From a Piagetian point of view, and I think from any point of view, you'd have to agree that cognition is about consciousness, awareness, and processes that support awareness. And it's about the application of what one is aware of to reasoning and problem solving. From an information processing point of view, cognition is about executive functions. And that is primarily about verbal reasoning and verbal problem solving. That is, again, it's about consciousness and application to a problem solving situation. But it's about thinking about it via language, typically about procedures that you've learned from an expert, such as your parents or a teacher, that you've committed to memory, and then you retrieve under the appropriate circumstances to guide yourself in problem solving, and also to suppress, to keep down, to stop, to hold back interfering behaviors. It's this internal, it's all about the use of the internal language system in your mind. You know how we all are constantly running a conversation in our mind unless we engage in meditation one way or another, but in a normal state of consciousness, there is conversation going on in our mind, and we're using that conversation often to think problems through, plan, organize ourselves, etc. So the whole business of talking to oneself, particularly in retrieving and carrying out procedures or cause and effect explanations provided by others. That is the information, a big chunk of the information processing point of view about cognition, and it resides in the area of executive functions. Actually, the truth is much more complex than that. Cognition involves as well, from an information processing point of view, the processes that that support this executive use of language, such as memory processes, attention processes, discrimination processes, etc. And they also involve, really, if you, the kinds of representations that one uses in the course of adapting to the environment, representations. But for our purposes here, we will, and for assessment purposes in the field of speech-language pathology, executive functions is a primary focus in the area of cognition, so that what the individual is aware of when they're using language, when they're interacting with their environment, is critical in assessment. You have to, one of the focuses in an assessment of a language delay or a language disorder would be an assessment of language content. And one aspect of content analysis would be the question, how has the individual represented their world, their environment? What is their awareness of the world? And awareness requires mental representation. Language content requires mental representation. And that's the Piagetian cognitive angle. Also, we could also ask ourselves, given a verbal direction or given verbal instructions, how does the individual marshal those instructions and their knowledge that they need to not only act, but not act sometimes? How does that influence language performance in various contexts? Well, those questions are questions in the domain of cognition, and they direct assessment because we want to consider this maintaining factor, cognition, in any speech and language assessment as a potential maintaining factor. One more thing here. I am going to now ask you to please watch this. Put this URL in your little URL slot on top of your computer, and watch this problem-solving task I presented to Cameron, and think about the following, because I will address this as we meet for our synchronous reflection on this video material on maintaining factors, particularly the cognitive factor. Ask yourself, what components of the material presented to Cameron was he attending to as he responded to my questions? What components of the material that you'll see in the video presented to Cameron was he attending to as he responded to my questions? Be ready to answer that question when we meet. Now here, and then move on to video illustration 2. Again, please watch the following video illustration. Put this up in your URL slot, and think about how would you characterize the context of problem-solving tasks illustrated in this video as compared to that of the previous video that you watched. I think on the screen here it's the opposite, but it doesn't matter. Compare the two videos, the one you're about to watch, and the one you just watched before, and ask yourself, how does the context compare? The situations, the type of problem-solving situation. How did they compare? Are they similar? In what ways? Are they different? In what ways? And we'll discuss this again when we meet. We will next move on to the sensory motor system as a potential maintaining factor. Now let's consider the sensory motor system as a maintaining factor. The sensory motor system, you know how intimate the relationship is between sensory motor action and language. Our speech is all about movement and sensation. The sound system, that's really the part of language that we actually observe and measure with our ears or our eyes or some sensory system. And it's about movement and sensation. That is, much speech is about movement and sensation. And the various systems, the systems that interact to allow us to have speech, what would that be? Respiration, resonation, phonation, and articulation. Those four systems, they are sensory motor related systems. Not to mention the acts that we are skilled actions that we and that our clients enact on the environment to manipulate things, make relations among things, achieve goals, and ultimately reflect upon, so that they come to an understanding of the world and the language functions, social, pragmatic aspects of language having to do with social interaction, which is so much a movement and physical thing, particularly among caregivers and the people they care for. So sensory motor system is central to all aspects of language. And if you remember from language disorders in children, if you had me for that course, you will remember that these are the aspects of the sensory motor system I recommend we pay attention to. And that could, with problems in these areas, could come problems in the speech and language areas that these things contribute to. I want to make sure that I'm not messing up the sound here, which I have done in the past. I think we're okay. So we have tonicity, and that is muscle coordination. So we can have, hopefully we have typical tone, but you can have hypotonicity, low tone, or hypertonicity, high tone, and that could interfere with speech production and all aspects of language, really, content, form, and use. Related to muscle coordination, we be sensitive to body segmentation, coordination, and stability of our clients. Body segmentation refers to the ability to move the different parts of the body separate from one another, not necessarily together. That's very important because we want to be able to move our articulators. And in fact, the phonation, resonation, articulation systems, what did I leave out there? Respiration system. All of those systems we want to be able to operate and not be stuck and moving when, say, our hands are moving or our nose is moving or something like that. See, I can talk and move my nose more or less at the same time. That's important. We want these body segments to be able to be coordinated so that the client is able to produce skilled motor acts. The most skilled, of course, is speech itself. And body stability, we want to evaluate body stability. in the speech postures: sitting, standing, prone prop, side sitting. Body stability means not falling one way or another out of one's chair, standing and falling back and forth, where the entire body would have to really become undifferentiated, unsegmented in order to protect oneself from falling over. Body stability. We want to evaluate locomotion, how the client gets around to control and interact with their world. Very important, certainly, for content and use. And the ability to process feedback, the information the client gets from their goal-directed behavior, because this has to do with language use, efficient, effective language use, the development of language content, which very much requires the construction of mental representations supported by feedback from goal-directed behavior, and articulation, all of the speech movements which require the articulation of things that are interpreted as phonemes, and that really requires feedback to determine where to put, whether we put our tongue in the right place, whether we spread our glottis properly, etc., right? In other words, oral motor function. I anticipated that myself. We should also be sensitive to the medical condition of the client. I include that under sensory motor. So here's another video illustration I'm asking you to watch. Just watch 2 minutes, but you can watch more if you wish. This is power chair chick, a woman with athetoid quadriplegic cerebral palsy, and answer my question here. Reflect upon this question that I have for you, that we will again address when we meet for our synchronous session related to today's lecture. How would you characterize body segmentation and differentiation of speech acts, the differentiation of speech acts from other sensory motor behaviors, as chair chick was speaking? Watch her speak and characterize body segmentation and the differentiation, that means separation out, of speech acts from other movements of hers, like her hand movements, her body movements, etc., when she's trying to talk, or her effort to talk when other parts of her body are moving. Very good. Okay, so let's finally consider the last of the maintaining factors that we'll consider today, and that is affect emotion. The affect, the feeling states of the client, and the affect emotion relates to the psychosocial system, including culture, family, etc. And our consideration of affect and emotion in assessment focuses on us what? On the caregiver-child relationship, or on the significant other adult relationship, the client's self-concept, keeping in mind, by the way, that all of our clients and our own selves as clinician are on an ongoing basis assessing how others view our competence. We want to be competent. We want to be viewed by others as competent and acceptable, someone they want to be friends with, let's say, or at least have a relationship with, not somebody who they are going to laugh at, pick on, see us as somehow not adequate. The not adequacy ultimately leads to shame, what may be the most terrible emotion one could imagine. So we are looking for the client's assessment of their own competence, and also information about the caregiver-child relationship and culture the experiences, the community experiences, the interpersonal experiences that mean something to the client. Implication then from the idea that cognition, the sensory motor system, and the psychosocial system interact with language and contribute to content, form, and use, both competency and potential problems in any and all of those areas. The implications. Interprofessional assessment is ideal. That means where you are considering as a clinician what other behavioral systems are influencing the client, contact the specialist in that area. In the sensory motor area, that specialist would be the occupational or physical therapist. In the area of cognition, that specialist would be the teacher, and we ourselves, as speech-language pathologists, maybe a psychologist. In the area of social, emotional, psychosocial, and affect, the social worker, again, the psychologist, are people we could, and certainly, and bottom line, excuse me, the caregiver, the client's caregiver or significant other themselves, him or herself, need to be included in the assessment, not simply as somebody that we send notes to or keep out of the evaluation room, but actually individuals that we bring into the assessment so we're in the same place at the same time, at least part of the time, with the caregiver, with the teacher, with the occupational or physical therapist, same place, same time. Why? Because all behavior is context sensitive. So if all of these other individuals are viewing the client, our client, in a different situation, well, they may be seeing different behaviors. Plus, we can learn from others and we can teach others. And the best way to do that is to be physically together. Even though this is an online experience, we have the synchronous aspect of this lecture so that we can be together. Be together. Very important. And second implication of this material, we must evaluate baseline functioning in all behavioral systems that could contribute to a speech or language problem. Next up, standard norm referenced assessment instruments.